tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. There's a phrase that the Confucians use, rectification of names. And that means calling things by their right names and accurately. Basically, it's using language precisely. And I think this is something that we need to keep in mind when we're studying Dhamma and reading Dhamma books, suttas, or listening to Dhamma talks, that we are using the vehicle of human speech to transmit these ideas and concepts. There's a number of pitfalls to watch out for. One, right off the outset, is the limitations of speech itself, particularly when we're dealing with high dhammas, when we're dealing with subtle concepts like the nature of mind or liberation. Some things like nibbana, the unconditioned, is really quite beyond the realm of speech. And this is why you'll see in the Pali Canon, when the Buddha speaks about nibbana, it's very sparing actually in the whole corpus of the many volumes of the Sutta Pitaka, the discourses of the Buddha. There's actually very little discussion about the nature of nibbana. And what we do find is mostly either couched in negative terms, telling us what nibbana is not. And the critical text here is in the Udana, where the Buddha says there is the unconditioned, there is the unborn, there is the undying, etc., which are all negatives in Pali. Asankata, ajata, amata, a being the negative prefix. So it's just stating nothing positive about nibbana. Or else the other approach is to use poetic and metaphorical language to refer to nibbana as the island or the other shore or the one safe, secure refuge. So nibbana is truly ineffable, meaning it's not expressible in words, because words are products of the conditioned world. So there's this limitation. There's also the problem, which I want to get into a bit more detail about, is the problem of translation and expressing things that were originally expressed in one language, expressing them in another. This is not so simple and straightforward. It's not simply a question of one for one changing the words out. There is perhaps a naivete if we approach the teachings in our native tongue, if we're reading them in English, that we're reading an expression directly of what was originally expressed. And this is not so. This is a rendering or approximation. And the translator has to make choices. One of the things to bear in mind is that no two languages are fully isomorphic. Isomorphic means there's a one-to-one correspondence between the members of a set. So, for example, the numerals 1 to 10 in Arabic numerals, our commonly used numerals, is isomorphic to the numerals 1 to 10 in Roman numerals. Although they're different expressions, you can line them up. But languages are not like that. There's not a one-to-one correspondence between the words in languages. There's often an overlap, and we have to try and rephrase and paraphrase. So every work in translation is going to be filtered through the mind of the translator, who has to make choices. A common dilemma for a translator is to choose between literalism, trying to be as literally accurate to the original as possible, or making it readable and trying to express the spirit of what was expressed in the origin, and to find some balance between those two. And this is probably even a greater challenge when the original language is very different from the target language. For example, when we're reading Dhamma books that have been translated from Thai, Thai is a language that has no familial relation to English at all. It's an entirely different language system, completely different grammar, completely different structure. I remember the early translations of Ajahn Mahabhua's books. The new translations are much more readable, but the first translations of Ajahn Mahabhua's talks that came out were very difficult to read. And I remember, before I ever went to Thailand, reading some of those books and wondering why everything was phrased in such an odd way. And then when I got to Thailand and I learned a little bit about Thai, I had a rudimentary sort of level of language skill in Thai. I could see that they were trying to reproduce the original Thai almost word for word. And I was told by somebody that this was because the translators had such a high veneration for Lungpa Mahabua and his words that they were afraid to rephrase them. They wanted to represent them exactly. But when you translate a Thai sentence exactly into English, it's almost incomprehensible in places. So there is a problem with following the original too tightly. Translating from Pali in some ways is less of a distance from English because it's also an Indo-European language. But we're also dealing with a language that is, as a living tongue, is extinct and has been for many centuries, if it ever was actually a vernacular, which is doubtful. So there are actually many unknowns. There are many things that have to be, the scholars are not even sure of exactly what the meaning of the word is. And there are different theories of how best to approach translations of these kind of texts. One extreme is a guideline that one translator of Tibetan books into English, he says that his principle is that every word in the original should be replaced by a word in the target language, and nothing should be left untranslated. And the same word should be used throughout for any given word in in the original language. There should be one and one only in English. And the idea that no word should be left untranslated. This makes a problem when there is no word in English that actually means the same thing as the original word. And I can see this, and this man I'm speaking about, he translated the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and he decided to translate karma, which is a non-English word, as evolution, which is sort of a choice that sort of works barely in some contexts, but then he has beings in the bardo being chased around by the winds of evolution. It sort of makes no sense. The other extreme is to leave many words in the original and perhaps include a glossary at the back of the book. This is something that I've seen done in some translations. And one translator expressed the idea behind doing this is it's better to be not understood than to be misunderstood. You know, it's better to be left wondering and then try and investigate than to implant the wrong idea right from the outset. One extreme example of this school of translation, when Buddhism first went from India to China, some of the early translations of the Sanskrit works followed a principle that almost all of the nouns, other than really common ones, you know, mundane ones, all the sort of anything that had to do with the mind or meditation, even vaguely, had was left in the Sanskrit and just transliterated into syllabics so it could be pronounced. So this would mean a considerable amount of study before you could even read one of those texts. You know, it had the structure and grammar of Chinese, but the vocabulary was Sanskrit. And I know it's not easy to do a good translation. I've done a little bit of that myself. I don't claim to be a high-level Pali scholar, but I have enough Pali that I'm able to work my way through a text with the help of a dictionary. And I've done some translation. And one thing that kind of surprised me when I started doing that was I could read through a passage in Pali and understand it, have it in my mind what the meaning was, but then I had to really struggle to express it in English. And there was sort of the feeling of kind of switching gears, you know, like changing to a new operating system, trying to express an idea from that has been held in one language in another language. So it gave me a lot of respect for really good translators like Bhikkhu Bodhi. His translations are really excellent. But even the best translation, you have to always bear in mind that's what you're reading. And some of the ancient texts that we have are particularly problematic because we're reading them translated through at least two languages. For example, the Vimuttimagga was originally written in Pali. The Pali is no longer in existence, and we have only a Chinese version, Chinese translation, and then that's translated into English. So you're reading something that's been translated through two languages. And there are a number of texts that were only preserved in Tibetan or Chinese that were originally written in Sanskrit or Pali. So one thing I would like to recommend to anyone who's studying the Buddhist literature, if you're reading Buddhist books, particularly scriptures, but also even modern books that are written about Buddhism, is it'd be very useful to not, I mean, it'd be ideal if you learn some Pali, but I don't think that's necessary. But what is important is to try and at least acquire a moderate vocabulary of the technical terms, so you understand when you see a word in English, you can translate it in your mind and have a more precise meaning rather than the kind of approximate meaning that the English word has. And this isn't just an academic problem, it does have a direct bearing on our practice. It's something that I've noticed for many years now, and I try to incorporate it into my teaching, is how the use of standardized English terms for concepts around meditation has been misleading for people. It's caused a lot of difficulties in practice that are unnecessary. One that I often bring up is the use of the word concentration, which is a standard translation for samadhi. And you'll see in books concentration meditation or developing your concentration. What they're talking about is samadhi, which is really has very little to do with concentration as we use that word in English. Concentration, as we assume it in the mental use of when you're concentrating on something, you're like narrowing your mind down onto a topic. You're boring into it. Like you have to concentrate when you're filling out your tax return. This is concentration. And that's not what you should be doing when you're developing meditation at all. And the samadhi is defined in the old texts quite differently. It's defined as non-wavering or stability. So it's stillness, non-moving of mind. And the mind with powerful samadhi is not narrow and tight and focused in that narrow sense. It's broad and expansive, but it's not moving. It's not flitting about. It's remaining with the object. Similar problem comes with the Pali term ekagata, which is standardly translated as one-pointedness. And ekagata is a quality, it's related to samadhi. It should be better understood as unification of mind. So it's not a mind narrow to a point, but it's a mind that has only a single content, even though it can be a very vast and expansive mind. Has that quality of samadhi, of stillness, and the ekagata means it's unified. It's not divided against itself, thinking of this and that. There are many, many examples. One is in the formula of the Eightfold Noble Path. We have right view, right intention, and so forth. In Pali, the word we translate as right is sama. And that right is not completely incorrect as a translation, but it can be a bit misleading. It's like you have a Venn diagram and they're overlapping circles. So it's partly correct and partly incorrect. The problem is that right tends to give it too moralistic a flavor in English, whereas sama is defined as thorough, correct, as it should be, or perfect. One kind of interesting one that a curiosity that I'm not sure how it originated, but we almost universally talk about the experience of the Buddha or an awakened being as enlightenment. And enlightenment doesn't really translate anything directly from the Pali texts. This experience is given various names: Vimutti, liberation; Bodhi, awakening; Phala, the fruit. And somehow we've settled on the word enlightenment. Likewise, actually, the Buddha, in the Pali text, he's almost never called the Buddha. That's one of his attributes. Buddha means he's awake. He would refer to himself as Tathagata, and other people, his followers, would call him Bhagawa. So there are many, many of these cases where the English word that has become standard has a slightly different meaning than actually the intended original word in the Pali. Some words have their particular difficulties, like consciousness. In Pali, we have chitta or vijnana, and it has a precise meaning. And someone who knows the teachings and is approaching them from that basis can have at least a intellectual understanding of what the chitta means. But when you see consciousness in English, it's actually such a vague word used quite differently by different writers. Sometimes it includes thought, which is not included within chitta. So it's really, it can be misleading depending on what presuppositions you take with it. There was a book I read once. It didn't really have anything to do with Buddhism or meditation, but it was a book about nature of consciousness. They were actually papers from some conference of psychologists and cognitive scientists and neurologists and so on about nature of consciousness. And what struck me is that they were all using the word in a different sense. Two of the extremes I remember was one of the writers defined consciousness as advanced processing of information, and he said that on this planet only humans and maybe chimpanzees are conscious. And then another writer defined consciousness in terms of stimulus and response, and he had to say that even something like a simple machine that has a sensor and reacts to it like say an automatic door would be conscious in some sense, because there's a stimulus and a response. So these people were having a whole conference on consciousness, and it was a concept that they didn't even begin to have an agreement on what it meant. So when people read consciousness in a book about Buddhism, and if they're taking some ideas from outside of the Buddhist system into what that means, then they're going to be misled. Chitta is very precisely understood as being the experience of experiencing. To be conscious, to be aware, it's just to be present, to have some experience of the present moment. One of the words that many writers and speakers about Buddhism have singled out as being very difficult to translate is dukkha, which is quite central to the understanding of the teachings, because it's the Four Noble Truths hinge around the word dukkha. There's the truth of dukkha, the truth of the origin of dukkha, the truth of the ending of dukkha, and the path leading to the ending of dukkha. and it's been standardly translated as suffering. And this causes a misunderstanding because suffering is a much narrower word in meaning than dukkha. Even pleasure is dukkha, but we don't think of pleasure as suffering. So there are many other possible translations that have been tried, such as unsatisfactory, stress, imperfection, and all of these can be argued, and so they have their merits and demerits. But the real bottom line is there is no single English word that properly translates dukkha completely. It's a concept that should be taken up on its own and understood on its own without overly relying on English translation or definition. Pali was a very precise language for defining things to do with the mind and the operations of the mind. It had quite a technical vocabulary that way, which English is much looser in that sense. So when we're reading it in English, it's always going to be somewhat approximate, if not outright distorted. When you learn any kind of technical field, if you're studying computer science or geology or anything, part of that is acquiring a technical jargon. Every field will have its set of terms that precisely defining operations and objects within its purview. And it's the same thing with studying Buddhism. It's really very useful to acquire an understanding of the meaning of the various technical terms if you really want to understand the teachings. I could recommend in this regard, there's a very useful little book that is actually now, it's a classic. It's been, it's written decades ago, and it's now easily found on the internet in PDF form. It's called a Buddhist Dictionary by Nyanataloka. And all it is a dictionary of all the technical terms in Pali. And if you look up something like, if you look up suffering, it'll be listed in English, and then it'll have see dukkha. And then you'll go to dukkha, and there'll be a bit of a write-up, short, like a few sentences, or in some cases it goes on. The longest ones go on for maybe a page, right up on the meaning of the word. There's the old classic Zen, the image of mistaking the finger for the moon. Somebody's pointing to the moon. He wants to show this, oh, look, this beautiful moon. He's pointing to it, and the other fellow's focusing on his finger. And this is the misapprehension of language is like that. You can't rely on the meaning of words to be exact. And as I said at the outset, particularly when we're dealing with very subtle teachings, that any expression of words is going to be, at best, a finger pointing to the moon. It's something to lead our mind into an apprehension of that truth without being able to express the truth completely in words. I think the Zen tradition seemed to have a very good appreciation of this. So a lot of the koans and cryptic little stories in Zen are such that the truth is not expressed overtly in words, but is an attempt to try and get your mind outside of the box of conventional thought and to apprehend the truth directly. And you may notice if you do meditation, that sometimes an insight might come to your mind, some kind of realization, some kind of new apprehension of truth may come into the mind in meditation. And then if you try later to express that in words, you can't really. It ends up being a failure to some degree or other. How it seems to work is that the initial apprehension of the truth is the purest form, and then you might immediately like drop down a step away from that and come up with a very short 3 or 4 words, kind of label it or express it, and that's pretty close to the truth. And then later you try and tell somebody else and explain it and speak in a few sentences, and it's totally garbled and doesn't really have the original meaning. So you can have a great deal of respect for teachers like the Buddha, who had a direct apprehension of truth and took up a teaching career for decades, teaching the Dhamma. And the Buddha was the highest expression of being able to express things in words. And even he would be reluctant to speak too much about the very highest Dhammas. Another thing to be on the lookout for is when you're reading different teachers and they seem to be in contradiction to each other. This used to bother me when I was young and starting to study Buddhism, that I would read something from one Ajahn or Sayadaw or Rinpoche, and then I read something from somebody else and it seemed to be making the opposite point. And it would kind of bother me, and I'd try to resolve it in my mind and figure it out. And then at some point it stopped bothering me. Is you have to appreciate that these are approximations in words that people are trying to express. They may have apprehended the same truth, but they're coming out from that truth into an expression in words from a different direction and trying to frame it in words as closely as they can, and it's never perfect. And the Buddha said, use conventional speech, but do not be fooled thereby. So there is a use and a value in intellectual expression, but to recognize its capacities and its limitations, and to try and use it as a pointer to an apprehension of subtler truths.